Okay, so we've got this big stack of documents here, all about these proposed changes to the EU Toy Safety Directive. Seems like the EU is really getting ready to completely redo its toy regulations, and we can break it all down.
Yeah, it's a really significant development. And you found some really interesting documents here. It looks like we even have what seems to be an actual draft of the proposed regulation.
A draft regulation. Oh,
Yeah.
wow, that's always interesting to see, what's actually being considered. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us some background? Why is the EU even thinking about changing these toy safety rules? What's going on?
Well, the current Toy Safety Directive has been around since 2009, and a lot has changed since then. Think about it. We've seen huge advancements in technology, new research, and just the way people buy toys is totally different now with online shopping and everything.
Yeah, online marketplaces have changed everything.
Exactly. And the EU wants to make sure that its regulations are, really strong and effective, especially when it comes to keeping kids safe.
Makes sense. And it seems like one of the biggest things they're focusing on in these proposed changes is all the chemicals used in toys.
Absolutely. They're taking a much stricter stance on any chemicals that could be harmful. And you can really see that in how they're approaching CMR substances. These are chemicals that are known to, or there's a really strong suspicion that they can cause cancer genetic mutations or problems with reproduction. Having them anywhere near children's toys is obviously a huge concern.
Yeah, those are definitely not things you want kids playing with.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond just CMRs, right?
Right. They're also proposing stricter rules for endocrine disruptors, which mess with hormones, respiratory sensitizers, and really any chemical that could be harmful to specific organs.
So they're really trying to cover all their bases and think of every way these chemicals could be a problem, especially for younger kids.
Exactly. They're even going so far as to propose what they're calling generic bans on the worst offenders. Basically, if a chemical is considered high risk, it's out, no questions asked.
No more messing around when it comes to these dangerous chemicals.
Yeah.
But I did see something about some exceptions to these bans. What's the deal with that?
It's important to remember that those exceptions are going to be very limited. Like for a company to even be considered, they would have to prove that the substance is absolutely essential to the toy, that there's no safer alternative, and that they can use it in a way that is totally safe.
So the doors open a crack. But it sounds like it's going to be really hard to get through.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's going to be really hard to get an exception. And that makes sense when you're talking about kids' health.
Absolutely. And speaking of substances that might be banned from toys, one that stood out to me was bisphenol A, or BPA. It seems like they're proposing a total ban on BPA in toys. What's behind that decision?
It's mostly because of this new research that came out from the European Food Safety Authority. They call it EFSA. Their newest risk assessment on BPA basically suggests that it's much more dangerous than we originally thought, especially for children who are much more vulnerable to its effects.
Oh, wow. That's concerning. BPA is in so many things we use every day. To think about banning it from toys is a big deal.
It definitely shows you where things are headed. It seems like the EU is really being careful here and making sure children are protected, even if the science on a chemical is still developing.
That makes sense. They're really paying attention to new research and making sure that toy safety standards are up to date.
Exactly. They're being proactive so they can catch potential risks early on, which is really important with something like this.
It's good to know that they're making these decisions based on the best information. Now, besides all this stuff about chemicals, something else that I thought was really interesting was this idea of a digital product passport for every toy. That sounds super futuristic.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. We could be talking about a complete overhaul of how toy safety is managed. Instead of using paper trails, they would switch to a digital system.
So no more digging through tons of paperwork. Everything would just be available with a quick scan.
Yes. Imagine each toy sold in the EU having its own unique digital fingerprint. This passport would have everything about the toy's safety and all the documents to prove that it's compliant.
So instead of like a microchip or something, it would be like a QR code on the toy.
Yeah, exactly. They put a special code right on the toy or on the packaging, and you could just scan it with your phone and it would pull up all the information about the toy.
That's pretty cool. And no more trying to decipher all that legal jargon.
Yeah.
But this would be a big deal for regulators too, right?
Hmm.
Not just for shoppers.
Right. It's not just about being transparent with consumers, although that's obviously a good thing. The really big change here is how they could actually enforce the regulations. The EU is basically talking about connecting this whole digital passport system to customs.
So they could scan a toy at the border and instantly know if it's safe.
Exactly. Imagine a huge shipment of toys arrives, And instead of having to go through all the paperwork customs, officials could just scan those digital passports and boom, they
Mhm.
know right away if the toys meet the standards or if they need to take a closer look.
That sounds way more efficient, and it would definitely help keep dangerous toys out of the hands of kids. But what about the companies that actually make and sell these toys? This is going to be a big change for them too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Changing all these chemical regulations and moving to these digital passports will definitely mean some big changes for the toy industry. There are definitely going to be challenges, but there are also opportunities.
So it won't be all easy for toy makers.
Well, there are going to be some growing pains for sure. For example, like reformulating products to meet those stricter chemical standards, that could be really expensive. Companies might need to find new materials, redesign their toys, and change their whole manufacturing process. And then on top of that, there's the cost of setting up this whole digital passport system.
Sounds like a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's an upside for businesses too, especially in the long run.
Oh, absolutely. There will definitely be upfront costs, but the documents also talk about some advantages for the industry in the long term. For instance, having one set of rules for the entire EU would make things much simpler for businesses that sell toys in multiple European countries.
That makes sense. No more trying to figure out different standards for different countries.
Exactly. It makes competition fairer, and it's easier for businesses to make sure they're following the rules no matter where they're selling their toys in the EU. Plus, there's the impact on consumer confidence.
Because parents will be more likely to buy toys if they know they're safe.
Exactly. This way, everything is transparent, and there's a big focus on safety. That could really boost sales for toys that meet the EU standards and help build trust between consumers and the toy industry.
So potentially a win-win. Safer toys for kids and a better market overall. But this has to be about more than just the EU, right? These changes could affect the whole global toy market.
That's a really important point. The EU has a lot of influence, and other countries often follow their lead. Don't be surprised if other countries start doing the same thing to keep up and make sure their toy safety standards are just as good.
So we could see these higher safety standards becoming the norm worldwide.
It's definitely possible. Imagine if these digital product passports, with all the information about safety and sustainability, became the standard everywhere. It would completely change the way we think about how toys are made transparency and even how consumers choose toys.
That's a really interesting thought. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we should probably talk about the challenges. We've talked about how much this could cost and the logistics. But what about the kids? How will this impact them?
That's a great point. We can't forget about the children. Toys are all about play, and play is so important for kids to learn and grow.
Makes you wonder if all these new rules about chemicals will change what kinds of toys are even available in the future. I mean, could there be some toys that just aren't possible to make anymore?
It's a good point.
Will kids miss out on some types of play because certain materials aren't considered safe anymore? Something to think about.
For sure. Obviously, keeping kids safe is the most important thing, but you don't want to go so far that you stop companies from coming up with new ideas.
Right. We need toys that get kids excited to use their imaginations, be creative and explore, but those toys also have to be safe.
And that's where it becomes about more than just the rules.
Yeah, it's going to take everyone working together to figure this out. The people making the rules, the companies making the toys, parents, everyone.
We need to be asking ourselves some tough questions, like how can we make sure the rules are strict enough to protect kids, but not so strict that they stifle creativity? How can we help companies come up with awesome new toys that still follow the rules? And how can we as consumers be smart about the choices we make?
Those are really important questions, and there's no easy answer. But I think this is where you, the listener, come in.
I agree.
We spent this whole episode looking at these documents, talking about the changes and what they might mean. But now it's your turn to think about it and what it means for you.
Because at the end of the day, these regulations are only one part of a much bigger conversation.
It's about talking about these issues, asking the right questions, and speaking up so that we can shape the future of play.
So when you see these proposed changes in the news or online or even at the store, don't just ignore them.
Really think about it. Ask questions and make sure your voice is heard.
The EU is being really ambitious with these proposed changes to the Toy Safety Directive. They're trying to create a system where toys are safe, but also where companies are transparent and we're thinking about sustainability.
Whether they're successful really depends on what we do now, how we talk about these issues, and what decisions we make moving forward.
This conversation is just getting started, and we want you to be a part of it.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of toy safety regulations.
This was a really interesting one.
Thanks for listening, everyone.